Let's get realistic. Today I'm going to talk about realism, the view that some things are independent of the mind. It's a view that is, I think, in accordance with common sense. We tend to think that there are real things around us, things that are independent of my mind. My cats, for example, seem to be independent of my mind. They don't do what I tell them to do at all. And lots of things in the world seem to be independent of our minds. They're really out there. Not just that we can't control them, but they seem to be over and apart from us in a fundamental sense. Well, the realist says that's exactly right. They are really external to us. They're really out there. It's our job to know them, but on the other hand, their existence is independent. The first really prominent realist who argues in favor of realism in something like a modern way is Aristotle. Aristotle contends that, yes, of course, things outside of us really do have their own mind-independent existence. He imagines a world where there are no sentient beings at all, where you don't exist, where I don't exist, where no animals even exist. He says, look, in general, if only the sensible exists, that is to say, if only the mind-dependent exists, there would be nothing if animate things were not, for there would be no faculty of sense. In other words, he's saying if everything is mind-dependent and there are no minds, then there's just nothing at all. Nothing, period. But he says that seems ridiculous. The view that neither the sensible qualities nor the sensations would exist is doubtless true. If there are no minds, then there are no sensations for minds to be in. They are affections of the perceiver. But that the substrata which cause the sensation should not exist even apart from sensation is impossible. Why? Well, sensation is surely not the sensation of itself. There's something beyond the sensation, which must be prior to the sensation. There's something external to us, something our sensations or perceptions are sensations or perceptions of. I am having sensations of a world. There is some input to my sensory organs. We might, like Kant, say, well, in the end, I don't know what it is. I can't really describe it. It's something I know not what. But it's got to be something, Aristotle says. Look, imagine a world where there were no minds. Is that really just an empty universe? That seems bizarre. I mean, think about what we think about the physical world, about the realm of stars. It, from a certain astronomical point of view, seems incredible almost that life exists at all. So take away life. It still seems like you've got a possible universe there. And in such a universe, well, there would be no minds. There could be nothing that was mind-dependent, but there would still be stars. There would still be galaxies. And Aristotle says, that seems like a possible universe. And that tells us these things cannot be mind-dependent. There would still be a universe, even if there were no minds. So here's one way of understanding his argument. Sensations are sensations of something. Those things have to be prior to and independent of the sensation itself. So there are mind-independent causes of sensations, something like things in themselves, whether they're substances in his sense or something else. Now I want to turn to the arguments of Bertrand Russell and G.E. Moore, two British philosophers from around the beginning of the 20th century who diagnosed idealism in its modern form in people like Berkeley and subsequent figures. They say there's a fundamental confusion that motivates the idealist. And so Russell, perhaps more than anyone else in detail, gives us a picture of what this is like. But Moore also has a paper called The Refutation of Idealism, where he takes apart the idealist's argument and tries to show what's wrong with it. Their views are very similar, which isn't surprising. They were colleagues and good friends at Cambridge. So here is the idea. The idealist says that whatever exists, or at any rate whatever can be known to exist, must be in some sense mental. And so Russell begins with that definition and begins to say, look, there's an argument the idealists make for this, and it goes something like this. We have reason to believe that something exists only if we can know it. And here I don't mean know that it exists, I mean only if we can know something about that object, if we can come into some kind of epistemic contact with that object. But we can do that only by making it an object of consciousness. I am capable of knowing something about an object, or even believing something about it, only if I can in some way represent it to myself, only if I can make it an object of consciousness. But now an object of consciousness is conditioned by consciousness. And anything conditioned by consciousness is mind-dependent. So we have reason to believe that a thing exists only if it's mind-dependent. Well, so argues the idealist. Now, Russell says, okay, that's the basic argument. That's really what is motivating people like Berkeley, but also people like Hegel and other subsequent idealists. You can have a reason to believe that this thing exists only if you can have knowledge of the object, but you can know the object only by making it an object of consciousness. Any object of consciousness is conditioned by consciousness, but anything conditioned by consciousness is dependent on the mind. So anything we could know to exist is dependent on the mind. And now Russell says something's obviously gone wrong. And the moment you think about applying this to a real object, a real thing, you recognize something's terribly wrong. Let's apply it to my cat. This is my cat Zadok, out in a tree, enjoying nature on a beautiful spring day. Well, there's Zadok. We say, okay, I'm thinking about the cat. And so are you now. You're looking at this. You're in some kind of contact with my cat from an epistemic point of view. So you say, do I have any reason to believe the cat exists? Well, let's go through the argument. If you do, you say, well, I have reason to believe the cat exists only if I can know it. I can know it only by making it an object of consciousness. Then that third premise, an object of consciousness is conditioned by consciousness, and then anything conditioned by consciousness is mind-dependent. But Russell says, wait. I see a cat, okay? It becomes an object of consciousness for me insofar as I see and know the cat. So the cat is conditioned by consciousness? The cat is mind-dependent? That's ridiculous. That's absurd. The cat isn't affected by my seeing it or not seeing it. And so, wait a minute. All right, I see the cat. I do that by making it an object of my consciousness. But the cat doesn't go into my head. It's not that the cat becomes an object of consciousness, conditioned by consciousness. It's not that my cat changes because I see the cat. Indeed, that's what these philosophers end up calling, that's a mere Cambridge change in the cat. The cat is just sitting there. It's not affected by the fact that I suddenly perceive it. It is now being thought about by me. Well, that's a weird kind of change the cat underwent. It didn't suddenly become a mental object. There, the cat is, nobody's looking at it, so it's an object in the physical world, but suddenly it becomes a mental object, mind-dependent, when somebody looks at it? That's ridiculous. The cat doesn't change, except in this weird, convoluted Cambridge sense. Instead, no, what's going on is I know something about the cat, I perceive the cat, I form a representation of the cat in my head. The representation is an object of consciousness, and in that way, indirectly, the cat is an object of consciousness. My representation is conditioned by consciousness and so mind-dependent. It's a representation in my mind. But the cat isn't conditioned by consciousness. The cat doesn't become mind-dependent. The cat isn't in my mind. It's not affected one way or the other by my seeing it. So there's Zadok still in the tree. Zadok didn't somehow zap from the tree into my mind. Instead, I formed a representation of Zadok in my mind. So Moore and Russell argue that there is a basic equivocation in the very argument for idealism. The idealist uses object of consciousness ambiguously to mean, and here referring to something like Dignaga, but also to various other people who have raised similar objections, ambiguously between the causes of our perceptions and then the thing that is actually like an internal thing being represented. Or maybe better it would be to say, between the representation in the sense of the thing doing the representing and then the object being represented. Is the object of consciousness the representation or the thing that is being represented? The actual object, the cause of perception, the cat, for example, or the internal object, that is to say, what is sometimes called the intentional object, the appearance in my mind of the cat as represented. The cat as represented in my mind, well, that is, of course, mind-dependent because my representation is mental. But the cat doesn't become mental. The cat is still a cat in physical reality. So we've got to be careful how object of consciousness is being used. Here is Moore's general idea. We know actual objects in the world, like the cat, by representing them in terms of these internal objects, these internal representations. The internal object is conditioned by consciousness. It's mind-dependent. But the actual object is neither. So the thing in itself is still out there. It's not an object of consciousness in the sense that it has become conditioned by consciousness and is mind-dependent. No, it's mind-independent the way it always was. Well, Russell puts it this way. The notion of being in the mind is ambiguous. We speak of bearing a person in mind, not meaning the person is in our minds, but that the thought of him is in our minds. And so when Berkeley says the tree must be in our minds if we can know it, look, all that he really has a right to say is that a thought of the tree has to be in our minds. To argue that the tree itself must be in our minds is like arguing that a person whom we bear in mind is himself in our minds. The person you have in mind is not in your mind. The cat you form a representation of when you see it or think about it, that cat is not suddenly in your mind. Okay? An idea of the cat, a thought of the cat, a perception of the cat is in your mind. So Russell says, look, there is on one hand the thing of which we're aware, say the color of the table, or the cat in my example, and on the other hand, the actual awareness itself, the mental act of apprehending the thing. The mental act is undoubtedly mental, but is there any reason to suppose the thing apprehended is in any sense mental? So by my representing the cat by means of something mental, does the cat become mental? Does the table become mental? Does the color of the table become mental? No, they're still outside the mind. They're being represented by something in the mind. They're represented in something mental, but they aren't themselves mental. So Russell says Berkeley's view seems to depend for its plausibility on confusing the thing apprehended with the act of apprehension. That's the ambiguity or equivocation in object of consciousness that Moore was pointing out. The difference between the thing apprehended, the object of my consciousness, namely the cat in the outside world, with the act of apprehending it, the object of consciousness in the sense of the thing that is the representation in my own mind, or in what that mentally I imagine it to be about. So we've got to keep careful about the distinction between the actual objects, the things in themselves outside of us that are not conditioned by being known, but then the things that we construct as representations, as acts of awareness mentally inside the mind. Those things outside of us are known by our construction of representations inside the mind. Those are internal, and those things, well, yes, they're mental. They are about the thing inside in the world. And so what they're about in the best sense is not something mental at all. Russell and Moore here are assuming a version of representationalism. We know the things in themselves by representing them to ourselves as appearances. We talked about the problem of Locke, talking about ideas as what is before the mind when we think. And Moore and Russell are saying, all right, time out, Locke. You have just given us the troubles of Berkeley and Hegel and the other idealists. Why? Because you're saying, what's before the mind when I think? The idea. That's mental, that's the representation. What am I thinking about? A cat. So the cat must be mental. The cat must be mind-dependent. Everything's mind-dependent. Moore and Russell said, no. No. Being before the mind is ambiguous, okay? Yeah, in one sense, what's in my mind are the representations, the ideas, or the impressions, the sensations, the perceptions, etc. Yeah, that stuff's mental. But the cat is out there. And so I have the cat in mind, and I have my idea of the cat, or my sensation of the cat in mind, but in two totally different senses. Yes, what's before my mind when I think of the cat is, in one sense, my idea of the cat, in another sense, the cat. And don't confuse those. They're not the same thing. And by thinking, oh yeah, I have this representation of the cat in mind, so now the cat must be mental. That doesn't follow at all. So we've got to keep that distinction in mind. We represent the things in the outside world to ourselves by constructing mental representations. What's before the mind is, in one sense, the representation, in the other sense, the object in the world represented. So, don't confuse the thing in itself with the appearance, that object of our perception, or the perception itself, or the idea, with that thing in itself. One of those is mental and is being constructed by the mind, but the other one is not at all mental and is not being constructed or conditioned by the mind. So let's revisit that idealist argument and be careful about the distinction. We have reason to believe that something, an actual object in the world, a thing in itself, exists only if we can know it. We can know that thing in itself, that actual object in the world, only by making it an internal object of consciousness. Well, in other words, by constructing a representation of it. Any internal object of consciousness is conditioned by consciousness, and anything conditioned by consciousness is mind-dependent. So we have reason to believe that a thing, an actual object, exists only if there is a mind-dependent internal object. But that doesn't mean the actual object is mind-dependent. It's that internal object that's mind-dependent. So I can know that something exists only if I have the appropriate internal, mental, mind-dependent object. But it's not the same as that thing in itself in the world. You better keep them different. In our picture of Locke's philosophy of mind, they're different. Keep them distinguished. Keep them different. Russell advances this argument against pragmatism, but really against any version of idealism, because he ends up saying, look, it makes the world depend on us. We turn ourselves into the creators of the world. And he says, whatever else you want to say about me, I am not the creator. He says this, pragmatism seems to suggest that if I infer a world, there is a world. Yet I am not the creator. Not all my inferences and explanations could prevent the world from coming to an end tonight, if it were so to happen. Whatever accusations pragmatists may bring, I shall continue to protest that it was not I who made the world. Every idealist, in effect, ends up saying, we make the world. The world totally depends on the mind. We are each the creator of the world. Russell says, I don't know about you, but I am not the creator of the world. That is not my role. I am somebody who has the job of trying to figure out what's going on in that world outside of and independent of me. I am not its creator. It is not something that springs out of my mind. So say what you will, I am not the creator of the world.